Hello, I'm Lester Knutsen, one of the founders of the International Informix User Group. I've been developing database applications with Informix as a DBA developer and systems administrator since 1983. I am producing the Informix Tech Talk series for the International Informix User Group. Now that I'm semi-retired, I would like to give back to the Informix community that has taught me so much over the years. One of the first user groups I was part of had the motto, users helping users, which I think is key and I believe is the purpose of all Informix user groups. I'm very excited about this Tech Talk, the history of the Informix user groups. This started out as an informal conversation with some old friends. We called it an oral history of Informix user groups from a few old folks trying to remember stuff. There are three parts to the series. Part one is the early days from 1990 to 1994, which we'll talk about the Informix List, the FTP site, comp.database Informix, and how 1200 baud modems kept us all together. And this was before the internet. And then ends with a thunderstorm in Tampa where we all got together and decided to start the International Informix User Group. Part two is from 95 to 97, where the Informix user groups organized and we started the group, International Group for Real, the charter, the bylaws. We started the website, which I think was a key event. Would you believe the website was on someone's desktop? You'll meet in just a minute. And then part three, 97 to 2000 is when the International Informix User Group takes off. I started working with user groups in 92 after I just bought the first IBM PC. It had just come out. My company wanted one. So as I was walking out the door, the salesman said, "Would you like some free source code?" And I said, "Sure," because there was no code for the IBM PC at that time. He said, "Come to the library tonight. We're having a user group meeting and there'll be some free source code." Well, the free source code was printed on a dot matrix printer and it was really badly Xeroxed, copied. So to enter it and get it to run, you had to debug something. And I learned so much from that and had an absolute blast, met a bunch of good friends, talked, they helped out, we asked questions, and I was just hooked after that on user groups. When I moved to the Washington, D.C. area, I joined the Capital PC User Group, which was one of the biggest PC user groups in the country. And I worked as a volunteer in the newsletter, and that's sort of where I cut my teeth on user groups. Now, in 1990, I helped with the founding of the Washington area Informix User Group and started producing the newsletter for it. And in 93, we had our first one-day forum with 230 people. It was an awesome event, 6 speakers, just packed sessions. We had only planned for 120 and we had twice as many people. And one of the problems was we ran out of food, all kinds of things. There were just so many people, but it was a lot of fun. I also then attended the worldwide Informix user conferences in San Jose, which is where I met Walt and everybody else I'm going to introduce to you in a minute. And that's, in one sense, where this story begins. But let me introduce to you my other colleagues here who I really appreciate putting up with me for all the years and working together. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Walt Holtgren, and I got into all of this by initially starting a email list back in 1991 timeframe, and I was working as an independent software developer, and up until about that time, and then I went to work for Emory University in Atlanta, and from there, I got introduced to Usenet and comp.databases and this whole crowd of people here. So that's my claim to fame.
Carlton, say hello.
Hi, I'm Carlton Doe. I originally got involved with this through Lester and Walt primarily, and then also with Cathy. I was living in Salt Lake City at the time, was fairly new to Informix, was learning about it, wanted to start a local user group, and they helped me get it up and running. And then from there, um, life moved on. The IIUG, writing books, working for Informix, and now I'm one of the people at IBM supporting Informix.
And just as a preview, and I'll put this into the clip, uh, Carlton did a couple of great books, and I wanted to have a copy of them, and I don't because they're in moving boxes, but I'll insert that. You're the author of some great Informix DBA books.
As is Cathy.
And I was just going to say, and the next one is Cathy. And Cathy's got some great 4GL books out there. I actually, in moving office, I discovered we have 5 or 6 of your books in our office, Cathy. So Cathy, say hello.
My name is Cathy Kipp, and I was working at the as a computer person over at the Colorado State University Veterinary Teaching Hospital in Fort Collins. And we were going through a process of upgrading our computer system at the veterinary teaching hospital. And a guy named Jim Zapapas came and was like trying to sell us a computer, but what we really liked of what he showed us was Informix. I'd never seen like a database system before, and it was just, cool. This was, I remember back in the day though, when I saw my first spreadsheet too, that was really cool. Anyway, so Jim Zapapas ended up having a real interest in Informix too. And I think as we probed our memories here, we found out that he was actually headed up the Colorado Users Group at the time. So anyway, that was my start with getting involved in Informix, and then ended up just, doing a lot with it in the future.
Why don't you say hello, Mike?
Sure. Thanks, Lester, and thanks to all of you. Yeah, so my name is Mike Reetz. I began working with Informix in the early 90s, joined the Colorado User Group that Cathy mentioned. From there, started to attend Informix conferences, and at one of them, met Walt face-to-face, not over email because we didn't have cool technology like video conferencing back then. Yeah, that conversation grew into my joining the IIUG as the first sysadmin when we established our presence at iiug.org. I was the sysadmin for that domain and ran that site for quite a few years.
Cool. So diving back into history, somebody asked me, how did this all start? And if I had to pick one bit of technology that caused it all to start, it was 300 baud modems and UUNet. And Walt, why don't you tell us a little bit about the early days of UUNet and the Informix comp databases, Informix and the Informix List?
Sure. Back in the mid-1980s, I was working as a software developer, as I mentioned, and it was on the old NCR Tower 1632s. And I was renting an office from another client, and I was back there, and it was security oriented, and so it was all underground, and I would sit there in my little office with no windows, and I was trying to teach myself, you'll love this, I was teaching myself Unix reading only the man pages. And so I had come out of digital equipment sort of area at the time, and not only that, back then NCR would provide all the System 5 and all the Berkeley stuff at the same time. So not only was I trying to learn Unix, I had 2 copies of every command, that each of which worked differently. So in trying to figure out what was going on, there was a fellow named Lindsay Cleveland in the Atlanta area, worked for AT&T, that started this thing called a mailing list. And I got wind of it and went down, and Gene Spafford at the time was working at Georgia Tech. And this is another good one. He introduced me to what Usenet was. and they would offer anybody a hookup over a modem, but it had to be at least 1200 baud because you could copy all of Usenet down overnight at 1200 baud. That's how old it was. So I got all that, and then found out there was an NCR mailing list, and about the same time, the Atlanta Unix Users Group was starting to form. And they had a model that basically there were no dues or anything, and they just would hit up various vendors for a place to meet and things like that, and convince the vendors that it was in their interest to provide those resources. And so that was sort of an inkling of the idea of my personal opinions of how IIUG ought to work, not have dues and not have a professional user group management firm do all the work, which is sort of the model that IIUG was using, at least back then. And so that was in the early 80s. And I went to work for Emory about 1990, somewhere in there. And so they were a university. And so back then, university and the military was about the only people that could afford or had access to the internet. This is before it got really commercialized. And so I was working with another fellow in the software shop at the time, just two of us. And I had this nagging fear that every time I got on the internet, somebody somewhere was recording it and they were going to come give me a bill for charges for the internet. And I told it to the guy, and he just laughed at me and said, no, that's not the way it worked. So from there, got on to comp.databases. And at that time, there was just that one news group. And so if you had Oracle or Informix or anything, you just posted to it. But the usage was growing and growing. And I had started Informix List somewhere early in 91. And so that was growing and growing. And we being Informix, the Informix user community, decided that it was crazy to have all this noise on CDI rather than comp.databases. And so that's when comp.databases.informix was being discussed and formed late in 91, I guess it was. And it was the first subgroup of comp.databases. And so I put this little software gateway together where Informix List and CDI could talk to each other. And sort of that's how the very early idea got of a separate worldwide community of Informix users was CDI, and then things just kind of grew from there.
And didn't you also start the FTP, the public domain anonymous FTP site for Informix?
Yes. At about the same time, where I was working was the department of Emory University, and another one of those organizational units was the School of Math and Computer Sciences. And they had a big server over there. And so it was all sort of, we were, each of the departments, the IT people, there's only a handful on each one, so we all knew each other. So I had a free account over on the MassCS, masscs.emory.edu. So that's where the original anonymous FTP archive started until Mike started mirroring it also, and that kind of led to everything sort of sliding over in his direction.
I remember going to, I think, just one user conference in San Jose, and I clearly remember it because it was after the Bay Bridge had gone kablooey and they were rerouting all the roads in the Bay Area. And I tried to go visit my parents afterwards, and I remember just getting totally lost because my dad said told me how to go. Totally lost. And we didn't have GPS back in those days, by the way, folks.
Yeah.
Yeah, try explaining that to my grandkids. They're like, what is that? How can you get around?
How can you get around?
Show them the paper Thomas guide books, page 497, grid E3.
So, Cathy, you mentioned, I think, a person that is key in this getting started who's not here, Jim Sapapis. He and I shared a booth in the 93 Informix conference. It was a WAG and the Colorado User Group. We both said, hey, we'll share a booth. We put material there. We wanted to go attend sessions. We didn't want to sit at a booth all day. So we basically had a booth with materials there. And I think that was where we first started talking about user group. What do you all remember from when we first got started talking about having a user group meeting?
Well, from my perspective, I had the Utah group up and going, and by this time I had a relationship with you, Lester, Walt, and Cathy, and we were talking quite a bit about how we had little isolated pockets of Informix users, but we didn't really have a cohesive strategy to talk to Informix with. Things that bothered us, such as marketing or the advertising messages or what they were doing with the product, we felt that we had as users. I remember one of our early lines was users know what users want. And so we wanted to have some sort of a communication method. And as individual user groups, that wasn't happening. So the three of us at least started, and Malcolm started talking about, well, what would we do if we could create some sort of an umbrella organization? And we hashed that out for a little bit, which led to the infamous dinner in Tampa.
I was going to say, Cathy, you wrote the email that got us together for Cathy for the dinner in Tampa. Do you remember that, and what prompted you to do that?
I'm sure it was because of Walt's group, really. I mean, right? The whole email user list. And we started, those of us who frequented it back in those days and were able to get help from it, right? Just get help from other people who were trying to use the same tools that we were trying to use. It was just such an incredible resource, especially back in the day before we had all of the tools that we have now. And I think we just it just came about and people said, oh yeah, when we get to Tampa, we should go out to dinner. And yeah, and I think it sort of came from there. It's like, well, yeah, we should do this umbrella and try and get everybody on the same page. And yeah, that was pretty much it. I think it was just because we had a lot of really good, excellent people, which would be all of you guys and a few others, right? That really were excellent human beings to move forward with this thing with.
It was an awesome group to work with and get to know. So that anybody else have memories of that Tampa meeting that you'd like to talk about?
I just remember, if I remember correctly, that was the one that had the horrendous rainstorm while we were all sitting in the restaurant. I thought the whole southern part of Florida was going to blow away. It was really, really crazy. So I like to think of it was the winds of change that were driving all of us.
I remember one of you, or maybe one of the other folks who attended that dinner, took advantage of my gullibility and tried to convince me that there was a formal cocktail party as opposed to just, a meet and greet, and that I didn't bring along the appropriate clothing. And it's like, oh my goodness. And yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
I'm sure that sounds like something Malcolm would have done.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, that was probably Malcolm.
But he got you guys all to buy in. It's like, well, yeah, that's the way it is. And you guys were like, oh yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So we sat there around this table, and it was downtown, so there were all the office towers and everything, and the thunder was just echoing and crashing between the buildings, and we were struggling to hear ourselves talk, and that's kind of where the idea of putting an international group together came to be. And we said, well, let's talk about it for a year and let's kick it off at the next conference in San Jose. Let's do a session. Let's announce that we're starting an international group. And in between that Tampa and then that following San Jose conference, there was a lot of conversations between us, as to what we wanted to do, why we wanted to do it, and put together kind of a framework of what it could be before we before we submitted for the conference presentation that kicked it all off.
So Carlton, two questions for you. One is Malcolm's not here, and you introduced everybody at that San Jose meeting. You had some great introductions. I don't know if you remember them. Why
Yes.
don't you tell everybody about Malcolm for a minute?
So Malcolm Whelans was from the United Kingdom. He had a tremendous amount of Informix experience as a consultant and was also involved with the user group over there. Right now, my memory's a little fuzzy. I can't remember if he was ever part of Informix proper or if he was always just a consultant. But he was, in many ways, he was larger than life. He was always smiling. He was happy, always a laugh, a practical joker. He loved to drink, and he wasn't shy about indulging in participating, but he always showed up the next morning ready to go to work. And he was very adamant as we were talking about this organization and putting it together that we had to be international in focus. We had to bring different ideas, different perspectives outside of a U.S. centric view, if you will. He was always asking us, well, how will this, the equivalent of well, how will this play in Asia or in Australia or in Europe or here? He always made sure that we remembered that this was truly an international organization and had to reflect that in everything we did.
Awesome. And what was that first session we did at that conference, Carlton?
So as the next conference came about, it was scheduled in San Jose. And the four of us, Lester, Walt, Cathy, Malcolm, and myself, submitted a session called User Groups Around the World or something like that. And in the description of the application for the session, we said that we would talk about user groups and the kickoff of the new International Informix Users Group, because we'd kind of come up with a name by then. And the idea of the session was just that we would talk about all the different individual user groups around the world and introduce the concept of this umbrella organization that would be used to provide a unified voice from the user community to Informix on what we wanted or what we thought was important. And after we submitted that presentation, boy, the bonfires got lit and the lights burned long and hard in Menlo Park. And all of a sudden, they were very, very interested in what we were going to do.
Before we jump ahead, another person that we should note that was, I think, important in getting us started was Bill Dahl.
Yeah.
Anybody want to say a word about him? Walt, go ahead.
Yeah. I was trying to remember when I first got contacted by Bill. It was pretty early on. And I was never really sure if he was officially tasked with working with user groups and organizations of that nature, or if he just was that kind of guy and wound up being by default the person in their support group that did that. But he was really helpful. He actually, in one of the very early conferences, when I think it was, Mike, I think it was when we had just started the website and we were hitting up Informix for a Spark station to put something on at the booth, and Bill Dahl will help make that happen. And so, yeah, and he is out there on the net still organizing and getting people to, be involved in things of that nature. So that's cool. So that was Bill.
Yeah, I'm going to put some pictures in here of that first San Jose user conference and the first IIUG booth we had there, because I do remember Bill got us a workstation for that. And Mike, you were involved in setting up the IIUG web server then, weren't you?
Yeah, that was, I think, later in '95 because it was after San Jose. Because I think that's when Walt and I talked about this, and y'all had just announced really the formation of that group, and the web was new, and a web presence was needed. And I was working at the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research at the time, and uh, they had kind of at the time infinite what amounted to infinite connectivity to the backbone, and I had a machine available that could host it.
Can I interrupt
Yeah.
for a second and add another piece to this puzzle?
Yes, please.
Because there's somebody missing that without whom the IIUG would probably not be what it is today. And she came in after the session proposal was sent to Informix, and that is the infamous Christine Shannon, whom we all just loved to death and loved working with and was amazing. She was assigned by Informix to see what we, these rascally users who were trying to start this new organization, was up to. And she was assigned to us for that conference and worked with us from there on out. But there were two separate meetings at that San Jose conference. There was the actual presentation itself, user groups around the world, and then we had a birds of a feather session, which where a lot of very good things happened. And I'll let somebody else explain what happened there. But Christine was there for all of that and helped us build the foundation of what is the IIUG today.
Awesome. Well, hey, this was a blast, you guys. I had fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah,